Hi, I'm Dawn Westbrook Boyd, and this video is my capstone presentation and final requirement for the Masters of Science in Healthcare Interpreting from the National Technical Institute for the Deaf, a college at Rochester Institute of Technology in New York. My qualitative study is in autoethnography. I'm the subject. The documentation of my experiences and my journey through this research process is the data that was gathered. Autoethnography is a research method that has gained substantial popularity in recent years as a viable and credible way of collecting data. So the data I collected was not really gathered in a traditional research manner, but rather in a constructivist format that allowed me to share with you my findings. But the flexibility of autoethnography also meant that I could present my findings by sharing my story in a more creative narrative. Autoethnography requires absolute transparency. The study must be honest and share the researcher's self-observations, feelings, and thoughts, successes and failures, while collecting the research data. First, I need to share with you why I chose this specific research problem, and then I can tell you about why I chose virtual reality as a possible way of helping bridge the gap in interpreter education. My presentation will first look at a familiar research problem, bridging the gap in interpreter education, then a quick overview regarding problem-based and experiential learning, followed by how virtual reality is currently being used in other educational settings. And then I'll share with you my experiences creating a 360 3D virtual reality medical scenario prototype. I'll wrap up with my research results and conclusion. Like most interpreters, I studied interpreting at a local college that offered American Sign Language interpreting as an associate's degree. Upon graduation, we were told to obtain our state qualification and start working. So I did. Without any time in the field as an intern, without any observations in the field, watching professionals work on an assignment. It felt like I had been kicked out of the nest without a safety net. But when I got my state qualification, I sent it to a few interpreting agencies and the work started rolling in. That day, I assumed I was ready. I walked into the job assignment, which happened to be at a hospital. Yes, my first job was a medical assignment. I was nervous, my heart was beating fast, my palms were sweaty, I had dry mouth, I felt isolated and confused, and I was scared I was going to make a mistake or mistakes. I kept thinking, oh my gosh, how is it okay that I am here? I told myself I'd do the best I could, I'd be professional, and just try to make sure that the communication was clear. And if that meant I needed to stop, I would. It wasn't until I entered this master's program that I realized what I had experienced that day is something very real, and it has a name. It's called transition shock. In the interpreting profession, transition shock is what happens when postgraduate students walk straight out of the classroom and into the real world. And that gap from the classroom into the real world is what caused my transition shock to surface that day. And I can tell you that that feeling did not stop for a long time. The U.S. has approximately 115 interpreter education programs, also known as IEPs. That number may have changed slightly within the last year during my research, but I'm not sure. Sometimes they're called interpreter training programs, or ITPs, and even occasionally they're referred to as interpreter preparation programs, IPPs. But for the purpose of this study, I'll be using IEP. So how do interpreting institutions bridge the gap from the classroom into the real world? Well, in my IEP, we had a course in our curriculum called Safe Settings, but that was in a classroom with local deaf people from the community coming in occasionally to visit. We never interpreted for a deaf consumer. We interpreted for each other. We never discussed what to expect on an actual assignment, nor did we ever really discuss other interpreter experiences or observe their work in the field, because, well, that's just not appropriate or ethical or adhering to strict confidentiality, or is it? We had a final class called internship, and we, the students, were expected to find our own. Now, there are some institutions that offer a course in their curriculum called Observation Supervision, also known as OS. And these students that get that experience, in my opinion, are probably the most prepared to meet the challenges and demands facing interpreters working in the field today. Let me add that while my interpreter training program did not include OS as a part of its curriculum, it was a very positive educational experience. So why and how does this continue to happen? How is it that postgraduate interpreters continue to enter the field like I did, feeling unprepared? Are observations in the field so difficult to arrange that it cannot be made a national requirement? And what is it exactly that is blocking observations in the field or having a supervised internship in the field from happening in the first place? In her article from the International Journal of Interpreter Education in 2005, Elizabeth Winston says, although most interpreting programs incorporate some type of observation and practice requirement, often these requirements are accompanied by somewhat vague instructions, such as attend a deaf event and write a journal entry about what you saw. So my research problem isn't a new one. It's not authentic. As a matter of fact, it's been the topic at numerous conferences throughout the years. There are a plethora of papers and hundreds of articles addressing the need for filling the gap. As I gathered literature on my research problem, there were so many resources, there was no way that I could possibly cite them all. But as part of my research, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Carol Patre, who has been a leader in the field of interpreter education since the 1980s, and who, ironically enough, is the daughter of Stanley Patre, a former science teacher at NTID. When I posed the question to Dr. Patre about bridging the gap in IEPs, she said she believes in order to truly develop the skill of interpreting, it must happen in 3 stages: observations, a supervised practicum followed by an internship that would last approximately 6 months to a year, and only after that did she believe an interpreter had bridged the gap from student to practicing professional. I also had another wonderful interview with a leader in the field of interpreter education, Dr. Annette Miner. In 2017, Dr. Miner published 2 papers specifically about bridging the gap in IEPs by using what she recommended as simulated learning, also known as mock scenarios. She believes that interpreter programs operate under numerous constraints that result in graduates being unprepared to effectively interpret in real-world settings, constraints such as college policies to a lack of standardized national curriculum. I continue to research what might be stifling progression on bridging the gap and making it a national standard in IEPs, and having internships and observation supervision in the field as a requirement. I interviewed peers and professional educators in the field of interpreting, and according to some of them, there seem to be a few other hurdles blocking bridging the gap from happening anytime soon. Some more obstacles are possibly strict codes of professional conduct with very little flexibility, fear of confidentiality breaches at medical offices or possible HIPAA violations, freelance interpreting agencies not wanting to team up with local IEPs for fear of liability, not enough resources to coordinate observations, and finally, ethical guidelines. Over the last 2 years, I have had the amazing good fortune to work under another leader in the field of interpreter education, Dr. Robin Dean at NTID. As co-author of DCS, the Demand Control Schema, Interpreting as a Practice Profession, she has addressed bridging the gap numerous times with her co-author, Dr. Robert Pollard. Both Dean and Pollard have written numerous articles, given presentations, and conducted workshops addressing this particular problem. In 2009, Dean and Pollard wrote, "When significant gaps exist between rhetoric and de facto practice, dangers of unexamined, unregulated, and unethical practices increase. And just recently, in 2018, in her paper entitled Over the Tipping Point, Using the Diagnostic Discourse of Standardized Patients to Educate Medical Interpreters, Dean writes about giving real scenario exposure to interpreting students, and she says that if this can happen, then interpreters can be prepared before they start to serve patients and providers through an educational endeavor that mimics the often valuable hands-on experiences of in vivo settings. Problem-based learning is a pedagogy where students learn a lesson by experiencing it through solving a given problem. Problem-based learning, or PBL, is a hands-on, or in our case, hands-up approach that gets students involved in the learning process. Now, we're all familiar with traditional or didactic teaching methods, such as sitting in a classroom, listening to lectures, or reading lessons, memorizing terminology. All of those are fine, but there's a place for both types of instruction in IEPs. My autoethnography dates back to September 2017, but it wasn't until I attended a conference on problem-based learning with Dr. Robin Dean in February of 2018 that my research question started to mold into a creative idea that might address my research problem. If my question proved a valuable one, it would also utilize my acting and my directing background, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's go back to September 2017, when Dr. Dean suggested that I turn towards problem-based learning as part of my research topic, and she told me to go ahead and start a field journal. So I did. I purchased Day One, an electronic journal that would synchronize my daily and weekly entries to all of my devices. I started writing, and I was off. From September 2017 to January 2018, I began formulating my research topic and used PBL as my focus. Research idea number one. I'd be an observation broker, which meant I would pair up a local IEP with the local medical college standardized patient program, also known as SPP. Interpreting students would be given the opportunity to observe medical exams live and take notes on an observation supervision worksheet. These would be medical college interns who would be using actors as patients. It seemed perfect. An experiential learning situation in the real world, but also a safe setting. I thought it sounded like a win-win. Nope. Lunches, meetings, emails, waiting for approvals. But due to confidentiality of the medical students with the local SPP and very little to no support from the local IEP, this was a research idea that ended up being a fail. Research idea number two. I would do a case study incorporating in the field mock job assignments using approximately 5 final semester interpreting students from the local IEP. So the interpreting students would be emailed a mock job assignment, telling them the location, the time, the type of medical appointment they would be interpreting. They would show up at a real medical facility, and I would have pre-set up a real physician and a deaf actor as the patient. Then the student would be required to invoice the job, and we would meet after to debrief and discuss the experience. I actually loved this idea, but I can't remember. I was led to another research possibility. Don't know what happened. Dead in the water. Research idea number three. I would work as an interpreting intern / agency broker. I emailed the CEOs of 3 local freelance agencies where I work currently as an independent contractor. Okay, so transparency. I printed and held on to the copies of these agency letters for over a year and a half in a folder. As I was putting together this presentation, my dog ate them. I'm not kidding. And my computer crashed, so I lost the emails. You're just going to have to trust me. But the email said something like this. I'm working on my final capstone project for graduate school, and I'm hoping to link up final semester interpreting students with a certified interpreter. The goal is for the interns to observe real-world assignments with an experienced interpreter. I said, most practicing professions use this form of experiential learning: medical colleges, law schools, even culinary schools. So would you be interested in teaming up with me so that I could collect data on the students' experiences? All three agencies said the same thing. And their reasons? Liability, time and money, not enough staff to facilitate obtaining job-to-job permission, scheduling nightmares, and lawyer fees. They reiterated the cost. And one agent even wrote back saying, "Come on, confidentiality is always a worry. We all know that interpreters talk about assignments out in public. My agency cannot take the risk." I responded by reminding them that the student would not be doing any interpreting, only observing, and that I would be doing all the work, not their employees. But they were less than interested in continuing. I was actually told by one agent that law students, teaching interns, and medical schools work very differently from interpreting programs. And interpreter observations, well, they would just throw up way too many red flags with HIPAA and FERPA and the risk. So just like that, all three of my problem-based research ideas were blocked. Why? I was more than frustrated, but then I realized as I was journaling one day that I had encountered the same constraints and barriers that are blocking a national requirement for internships or real-world observations in IEPs. The only difference was that now I was being affected by these bridging the gap barricades, but not through my own transition shock, but as someone trying to help bridge the gap. My research was just deadlocked. My ideas were thrown out the window. It blew my mind. But then, I went to the conference. My aha moment happened on the last day of the conference, at a presentation describing how virtual reality was being used in primary education. I thought, wait, oh my gosh, maybe we could do this in interpreter training. Maybe we could help bridge the gap if we could get away from something that looked like this and turn it into something that looks more like this by using this. Could a journey into the world of virtual reality help bridge the gap in interpreter education programs? Finally, after 5 months, I had found my research question. Maybe the concept of using VR in IEPs would give interpreting students observations in medical settings to help bridge the gap from the classroom into the exam room. In 2018, from March to September, as I started peering through the looking glass of a virtual reality camera lens, I also encountered some recurring themes as I started to collect my data. They were, I read articles, I bought books, I purchased 3 online training courses to learn about filming in virtual reality. I searched for funding and education grants because this research was going to require some money in order to do it. I wrote emails and made numerous phone calls. Ironically, I received little to no support from my institution, but in all fairness, I started going full force as summer break was just starting, so correspondence went unanswered. But I remained diligent and determined. I contacted 5 video production companies and started gathering proposals to make my VR prototype medical scenario. I learned to speak and geek, as I called it, so I wouldn't sound like a novice when gathering proposals. And I researched if any IEPs were currently using VR in their curriculums, and I couldn't find a thing. As the fall of 2018 began approaching, it became very clear to me that I could no longer procrastinate, and I needed to move forward with my Capstone project, with or without funding, with or without the help of the institution. So I entered a journey into the world of virtual reality with no money and no assistance and no prior knowledge of filming in VR 360, but I figured it out because all I kept seeing was this and this and dreaming about this and just honestly getting really excited about the possibilities of this. So I moved forward. I borrowed money from my daughter's college fund. I signed a contract with Creative Awareness, a production company, and paid half up front. I met with the legal team at the hospital, and I signed a contract, which required proving that I had a professional liability policy. I chose the hospital location, which was going to be the pre-op area. I set a shoot date. I hired a deaf actor as the patient, a doctor who is actually my husband and an anesthesiologist and works at the hospital, and I hired a photographer. I wrote the demand control schema medical scenario script, and it was an outline with specified lines about medications. I had various pre-production meetings with the videographer, and I rehearsed with the actors. After a lot of research on filming in VR, I purchased the Views Plus 360 camera, an SD card large enough to hold all of the digital recording, and a pair of Oculus goggles for viewing my video prototype in high-def 3D. I solicited the help of my cohorts in the graduate program by having them share some of the demand control schema situations they had experienced during their time as a practicing professional. I created a Google document that they could add to at any time. They did, and I was very appreciative of their help. I wrote the actual demand control schema script and highlighted the important lines I wanted to include in the scenario, such as this paralinguistic demand, a miscommunication between the anesthesiologist and the deaf patient about current medications. I created a talent release and an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement, for everyone to sign the day of the shoot. I set the actual film date for Saturday, November 10th, 2018, and I titled it Interpreting in the Pre-Op. The production team and talent had a call time of 8 a.m., and at 8:30, we started collecting the actual data I needed to complete my autoethnography on filming in 360 3D virtual reality. I encountered a couple of unforeseen obstacles the morning of the shoot, which is pretty normal. And as the saying goes, you hope for the best but expect the worst. When it comes to directing, my motto has always been, be flexible but be ready. So, number 1, guess who forgot to hire an interpreter for the shoot? Yeah, yours truly. At one of the earlier rehearsals, the actor playing the patient even asked me, who's going to be the interpreter? Well, I just thought he meant in the scene, and I said, me. With everything going on and production costs escalating on what seemed to be a regular basis, it just did not occur to me to hire an on-location interpreter. But I found myself needing to concentrate on the production and directing aspects of the shoot. So that was definitely a gross and obvious oversight on my part. Obstacle number 2. The tripod versus the camera helmet. With virtual reality, we could not use any lighting equipment in the room or it would be seen. Actually, anything in the room or down the hall would be seen because there are a total of 8 lenses in all 4 directions, thus the 360. During a pre-production meeting, the videographer suggested that I create a helmet that I could wear during the shoot to get the interpreter's perspective, or POV, point of view. During my rehearsal and preset, I saw him in the corner of my eye setting up a tripod with the Views camera on top. I thought he was just testing the camera while I was rehearsing, but he said he was ready to go and that, well, I needed to go down the hall to the other room and interpret from there and we could start. Okay. Anyway, I said I needed to put the helmet on and stand on my mark. But more importantly, it would not be possible for me to interpret from down the hall because I had to be in the room and this was going to be a completely separate room down the hall. This conversation between the two of us went back and forth and it started to get uncomfortable. What we had discussed in our pre-production meetings was suddenly like null and void. I called a break and we went into the other room and discussed what had actually changed. He got snippy and in the end we decided to go with the camera helmet. You can see how happy he was about that. Unforeseen obstacle number 3. We'll call this the interpreter position. We checked the iPad for positions and framing, and he said, well, okay, here's where you need to stand. He placed me, the interpreter, in the wrong position. I questioned it and said that we would never stand in that position, and he said, it's 360, it'll work, to trust him. I believed him because I couldn't see the monitor, nor had it been discussed that I would not be able to see any of the playbacks while on location. Had I been told this in advance, I could have researched how to find an alternative for viewing the footage. But at this point, honestly, it was just too late in the game, and I did as he said and ended up standing in the wrong position. In the final prototype video, the IV bag dangles in the upper right-hand corner, which is very distracting. And I could have fixed this had I been able to see a playback. The video has the interpreter at the foot of the bed, not at all where an interpreter would stand had this been an actual job, which is behind the hearing consumer, in this case, the doctor. I still wish I could fix that, but oh well. This was a prototype. I learned my lesson. So, those were the unforeseen obstacles confronted on the day of the shoot. But all in all, it was a productive and a very pleasant morning, and it was so easy to shoot. We did 7 different takes in under 45 minutes. There were no resetups of the camera, no changing of lighting, no mic issues. And 45 minutes? That was a very pleasant surprise. My research results were, simply, virtual reality works. Expenses can vary from low to as high as you want to spend. VR is currently being incorporated in nursing training. It's helping doctors learn new medical procedures or how to use new surgical tools, law enforcement training, and even taking elementary students on field trips to the zoo without ever having to leave the classroom. Equipment is more accessible, and that seems to be a growing trend. And VR might be a good addition for IEP curriculums, and if used with demand control schema training, it would give interpreting students the experiential observations necessary to help bridge the gap. And last, but certainly not least, until there is a national observation supervision requirement or internship in all IEPs, virtual reality could give students the opportunity of being in a medical setting without ever having to leave the classroom. There is one caveat to virtual reality, and that is that it may not be for everyone. Virtual reality sickness is real, and some people experience symptoms such as loss of spatial awareness, nausea, headaches, eye soreness, dizziness, and disorientation. On the positive side, it is recommended that VR goggles only be worn for approximately 10 to 20 minutes at a time, which is perfect for interpreting observations or virtual reality practice videos. My budget and production cost totaled $5,440. It was suggested at one point that I simply research how virtual reality was being used in other education settings and see how it might be applied to IEPs and not actually do it. But what's the fun in that? I needed to try it out. I needed to venture into an area that is not currently being used for training for our practicing profession. I needed to see firsthand if it could work. I'm a glutton for punishment? Maybe. Was it worth it? Every penny. My results and conclusions showed very positive results, that virtual reality recordings work in 360 or in 360-3D. Virtual reality could help close the gap by offering interpreting students the opportunity to experience real-world observations without ever having to leave the classroom. Originally, I had thought that this VR prototype would give the viewer the POV, or the point of view of the interpreter, but I realize now that VR might be best used as an observation tool. Nonetheless, however it's used, VR gives students a fun and important experience that could potentially help solve a problem in the interpreting profession, and a problem that's been researched for years, and the profession seems to still be searching for an answer. VR used in conjunction with Dean and Pollard's demand control schema would be great for observation training, for work analysis. It would open up classroom conversations about the demands that were observed. Questions such as, what were some of the environmental demands that you observed? How did you feel? What did you know about the terminology, or were you familiar with the procedures that were discussed? You get the idea. In closing, let me say that my journey into the world of virtual reality was not easy. It was energizing and exhausting, discouraging and problematic, fun and creative. And in the end, one that I would call a successful qualitative research study that had positive results. This autoethnography is part 1 of my journey. Part 2 is already in the works. I'm producing a market-worthy video because the rudimentary execution of my prototype isn't. I am currently working with an award-winning professional video production company to market this idea and see if there's interest. If there is enough interest, I hope to continue my exploration using virtual reality as a way of helping bridge the gap in interpreter training. Here's the link. And remember, it needs to be viewed using a mobile device and using VR goggles. Without them, and to the naked eye, it just looks like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Please feel free to contact me for discussions or for feedback, and thank you so much for watching.